So my focus in this seminar is on the conversation between Muslims and Christians in reading the Gospels together. I will try to draw out some of the expectations we might bring to the texts of the Gospel by looking at the flow of conversation and ways in which intertexts were brought to bear on the text. I'm particularly considering what the unspoken expectations might be underlying the conversation and how this may lead to further reflection or learning for those who participate in it. I want to make it explicit that the responses in the conversation do not represent Christians or Muslims as a whole, and that they were brought by individuals who were prepared to open themselves up to vulnerability and challenge, while nevertheless seeking to be faithful to their belief and understanding. As I suggest in the article, the conversation is read most beneficially with the text of the Bible's Sermon on the Mount open beside. If you do have access to the text, it's in the Gospel according to Matthew, chapters 5 to 7, but I have the relevant passages on these slides too. The point of considering the processes of conversation, together with texts and scholarship, in my view, is the emergence of perspectives that serve two purposes. Firstly, I think it is about responsiveness, to reflect on the extent to which conversation partners are responsive to each other. And that can be across religions, inter-religious conversation, or intra-religious conversation between members of the same faith tradition. Responsiveness is the breaking down of silos. It is hearing from my neighbor in conversation and having to formulate my thoughts in response to their questions and comments. Hearing both their interpretations and how their life experiences may have shaped their understanding, the hearer can bring the past and present together and think about the relevance of their questions. The second point of strangeness is to refresh our own perspective. The strangeness of a question or a point of view that we have not considered before because we may be steeped in our own traditions or our own readings of the Gospel or the Injil. The strangeness is not only the perspectives between Christianity and Islam, but may include the perspective of co-religionists, fellow Christians or fellow Muslims who have different experiences because they live in other parts of the world or they belong to other interpretive traditions. These two things, I think, are especially relevant to the Sermon on the Mount that holds up the kingdom of God as a community characterized by the Beatitudes, and that elaborates its meaning in terms of relationships that can include the conversations between people. The Beatitudes introduce Matthew's Gospel from chapters 5 to 7. This section ends with the observation that the crowds were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes, in Matthew 7, verse 28 to 29. The reason why this whole section, these 3 chapters, became known as the Sermon on the Mount is that compared to other parts of the Gospels that narrate Jesus' teachings in a more integrated way with his miracle-working healing, his authority over nature, and his conversations with those he came in contact with, the Sermon on the Mount presents teachings of Jesus that can be described as instructional or summative. It's where spirituality and practice meet, and seems to have been composed purposefully as the Gospel of Matthew's start to the life and ministry of Jesus as the Messiah. That is probably why it was given this title in Christian tradition as the constitution of a Christian identity. And this is probably why it was initially compared in our reading group with the farewell sermon of Muhammad as a constitution of a new community titled the Ummah. In chapter 5, verse 3, Surah Al-Ma'idah, you can note there that it says, "Today I have perfected your faith for you, completed my favor upon you, and chosen Islam as your way." This is the name given to a traditional report of an address given during the final pilgrimage of Muhammad that explains the background to this surah. Some of the comment in our conversation also noted Moses' farewell speech at the end of Deuteronomy as an intertext, serving a similar purpose of constituting an emergent community. There you see, "This very day you have become the people of the Lord your God," in verse 9. The reason why these comparisons were made is most likely because each of these persons, Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad, pronouncing these texts, are linked to particular identities that today we would call Jewish, Christian, or Muslim. They fit broadly with the Quran's terminology of people of the book, including its own emerging community as such a scripturally constituted one, and they also feature in the histories of nations that are recounted outside of these scriptures. It is perhaps the knowledge or assumptions about the histories of these founding characters that shape the expectations of both Muslims and Christians in the reading group. The conversation can be seen to reflect continuously on the relationship between worship and law that was put into the words of an early question from a Muslim whether Jesus brought social reform or a means to be closer to God. The question assumed a separation between these two purposes that then elicited reflection on the life of believers expressed through righteousness as a characteristic of those who are blessed. The question was, do we measure righteousness by the amount of suffering, such as the suffering of persecution? Or should it be measured by the extent of being in the right state to approach worship? Here the specific contexts of conversation partners were often in evidence, such as Christians from West Africa, who had developed what they termed third cheek theology. They said that they had turned both cheeks to their Muslim neighbors in the disagreements between them, so that they are seeking a third cheek to turn. A similar sense of persecution was expressed by some of the Muslims who found themselves culturally excluded in certain Western contexts. Or is righteousness to be measured by the extent to which we follow the law? In reflecting on the meek inheriting the earth, the question was to what extent this destination of earthly inheritance has already been fulfilled. Is it in the same sense as the Quran quotes from the Psalms in chapter 21, verse 105, that the people of God have been sent as a mercy to the nations? And the follow-up question was, is the earth our contemporary situation, or is it the one that will be inaugurated by the Mahdi? Or is Jesus speaking in terms of the promised land that has different nuances for the already but not yet situation of God's kingdom? These were the concerns of our time, but the gospel passages seem to be more concerned with the nature of humanity, where righteousness itself can be misrepresented through our earthly actions. The follow-up verses of how to be salt and light in the earth came next. What happens when we give in to anger, the corruption, the corrupting effects of adultery, divorce, and the swearing of oaths that invoke other powers in our lives? When thinking about the salt and light of Matthew 5, verse 13 to 16, religious leadership came in for scrutiny very quickly. Those who practice extreme piety, isolating themselves from the world, those that are represented by salt that is kept in containers, take their religion to excess, according to Muslim comment that cited Quran 5 verse 77, where it says, "People of the book, do not overstep the bounds of truth in your religion, and do not follow the whims of those who went astray before you. They led many others astray, and themselves continue to stray from the even path." So the conversation turned to Matthew 5 verse 17 on how we were to interpret the law and the prophets in order not to be excessive, but to be the light of the world. A Christian response to this conversation was that Jesus embodies all that Israel was for, and in this way fulfilled Torah. He does not shift the boundaries of law, but goes to the heart of the law. The comment was made then that the Beatitudes show what we are to be and therefore do, not to do in order to be found righteous. As the people of God, verse 17 suggests that we reflect His light in the world. This terminology of the people of God gave the sense of a chosen people, according to some Muslim participants, which was then critiqued, because in their view, the Quran commands all to be light. They ventured that with no dedicated priesthood, the law is universalized. That is, all people and nations are under one law of God, and are therefore to shine God's light into the world in obedience. A Christian response to this understanding was that in the Gospels, it is not the law that is universalized, but the people of God who are universalized. In a sense, the Christian understanding might be called an expanded Ummah as people of God in the earth. How this is to be applied in relation to the life and ministry of Jesus was implied by the follow-up question from a Muslim participant. Did Jesus reveal Jewish law to be globalized through the conversion of the Roman Empire? It was suggested in the conversation that history could be understood in this way. It noted that the Arabic Quran spread to other nations, seeming to confirm the chosenness of the Bani Israel in chapter 2 verse 47 of the Quran and 2 verse 122. And in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus maintained that he did not come to abolish the law or the prophets. So what is the law that the globalized Ummah or the universalized people of God should practice? The jots and the tittles of Matthew 5 verse 17 made us wonder whether the law can be adapted for pragmatic reasons, holding interesting analogies between the Hebrew and Arabic scripts, that both consist of consonantal texts to which diacritics were added later in order to aid recitation or meaning. It also made us think of examples where devotional practices have been amended or done away with. And one of the examples that we particularly thought of was the widening of the pillars of stoning in Mecca, also known as the Jamarat, to protect growing numbers of pilgrims on the Hajj. Here are pictures from 1953 and more recently, according to the website cited there, where one can see how the architecture was expanded. We could understand why the safety of pilgrims may be more important than maintaining that original architecture. But we wondered whether the law should be changed for pragmatic reasons. In search for these answers, the text of Matthew's Gospel seemed mostly to address the way we relate to others in the world, and ultimately that we should love our enemies, enemies. Sorry. Here it seemed to me was the main divergence between Christian and Muslim understanding. For some of the Muslim respondents, this was a form of hyperbole that was part of Jesus' teaching method to present abstract ideals, as it were prophetic opinions that represented the spirit of the law. In texts such as Matthew 5, verse 43 to 48, the idea of the lex talionis, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, where it gets expanded to not resisting the evildoer and turning the other cheek. If someone wants to sue you, expanding of each of the propositions. According to those in the conversation, this is only meant as a form of guidance. It gives one an aim to strive for, but that this teaching could only be for the spiritual elites, and that it is up to them to interpret it for the ordinary believer. So the conversation in the reading group did not provide agreement between Christians and Muslims on the intention of this text, but it did concede the following points. In seeking out the heart of the matter in the gospel passage, Jesus was not condemning the religious leaders, but entering into the debate about the place of the law, not declaring it null and void. Thus, the plucking out of the eye that may cause one to stumble, in verse 29, actually presents a judgment of one's own thought and actions. This, a Christian proposed, requires a transformed heart, or in different terms, a raised conscience. Muslim response suggested that the Quran's statement about the decree for the children of Israel, whoever kills a soul is as though he killed all mankind, and whoever saves a life is as though he had saved all mankind, which is from Surah Al-Ma'idah 5, verse 32, suggests that hyperbolic language, such as gouging out the eye or cutting off the hands and feet on opposite side of perpetrators that we find in the Quran in chapter 5, verse 33, is not to be taken literally. Instead, the law, written on the heart, commands me to judge myself, taking my soul to court, as it were, and discerning what God requires of us. The Muslim commentator added a 12th century Sufi metaphor that suggests in the quest for unity with God, temptation needs to perish, later adding that according to some Sufi traditions, humankind is a microcosm of God. This idea spurred the connection between the text of Matthew 5, verse 38 to 42, and the parts of Jesus' passion retold in every one of the 4 Gospels. Struck in the face, his cloak was taken, he carried his cross, dying for the love of those who crucified him. From a Christian perspective, therefore, the Sermon on the Mount's teaching of loving and praying for one's enemy is not so much a propositional ideal, but is demonstrated through the life of Jesus, so that they are provided with the authority to question their own attitudes and beliefs in the light of Jesus' example. It is the gospel description of the Messiah's laying down of his life and his resurrection that shows how God's kingdom transforms every part of the believer's life, not only for public demonstration or structuring of the outer world so that it leads to inner reflection, but a transformation from the inside out, where darkness is brought to light. And thus the question from the Muslim interlocutor on the conversion of the Roman Empire, probably implying the conversion of Constantine, speaks of a large-scale revolution and a relationship between faith in Christ and political power. This question was important for our conversation then, but it seems to have become a pertinent one for Christians and others in different parts of the world today. Revolution is by definition the turning upside down of ideas of power. But as numerous commentators have pointed out, the cross is hardly a statement of political power. It is, though, at the heart of the question about love for the enemy. This is the question that brought to the fore the point of concern between the Muslims and Christians present in our conversation. The cross stood out as the hyperbolic historical event that demonstrated the supposed paradox of loving one's enemies, not the cross as an embarrassment of powerlessness, but as overcoming of political and earthly power. For Christian understanding, it was to be fulfilled in the words of Jesus on the cross, saying, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing." This is the revolution of grace that would transform the world of individuals and societies for centuries to come, and is there in the question from my Muslim neighbor that continues to reverberate for me. To what extent is the revolution of the Roman Empire reflected in ethics and morality that imitate the Messiah, so that a society today would see itself as responsible to those in need? In their different contexts, Christians and Muslims may ask, how much does the state or public institutions value humanity, the care of unwanted children, sustenance for the poor, respite for the ill, sanctuary for the persecuted? Matthew 4 verse 23 introduces the sermon, framing it as good news of the kingdom. The identity of those in the kingdom is not along ethnic, linguistic, or culturally specific lines, but those who reflect the character of God. So returning to the two purposes of conversation, the question from my Muslim neighbor has held true for me. To continue responding to the question about the application of the Gospels from someone from a different faith, and to the responses I heard from my fellow believers, formulating my thoughts on the relationship between my conviction and my public responsibility. And secondly, I am grateful for the strangeness of the question about the public validity of my religious faith that I had not considered for a while, because I had been concerned with the faith of my community rather than with the foundations of my society's worldviews. However, this question was formulated 6 years ago in our reading group, and it prepared me for some of the social and political changes or events that have taken place in the world since then. His question helped me to keep in mind, as I hear the news every day, that Jesus' words may seem more radical than ever, because it is the meek who will inherit the earth. It would be the peacemakers that are blessed, for they will be called children of God. And those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake are blessed, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And I will finish there and hope to give you a time of reflection and question as well.